Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses as we continue with part 5 of History of the Jesuits by G.B. Nicolini. Chapter 4, 1541 through 1548. The Progress of the Order and its First General. Ignatius had no sooner obtained a bull from the Pope approving of the society than he thought it expedient to give it a chief, or, to speak more correctly, to be himself formally elected as such, being de facto its master already. In order, therefore, to proceed to the election of the general, he summoned to Rome his companions, who were scattered throughout different parts of Europe. 6 came. Bobadilla, Xavier, and Rodriguez sent their votes written. Both absent and present were unanimous in their choice, which, as one may well imagine, fell upon Ignatius. He, however, had the modesty, so we are told, to refuse the honor and insist that they should proceed to a new election. The second trial had the same result, but Ignatius still declined to accept the office. At last, on being much importuned to do so, he exclaimed, "Since you persist in choosing me, who know well my infirmities, I cannot in conscience subscribe to your judgment. It only remains, then, that we refer the contested point to my confessor, whom, as you know, I consider the interpreter of the divine will." The good fathers consented to this arrangement the more willingly, as they had no doubt to whatever, I should think not, that the Father Theodos would approve of their selection, nor were they deceived. On Easter Day, therefore, in the year 1541, he assumed the government of the society, and on the following Friday, he and his disciples, in the magnificent Basilica of St. Paul's at Rome, renewed the 4 vows to which they had bound themselves with extraordinary pomp and ceremony. We candidly admit, however, that Ignatius, after reaching the height of his ambition, relaxed nothing in the strictness of his conduct, nor allowed that zeal which he manifested in order to attain it to cool down. On the contrary, he seemed to redouble his energy and gain additional strength in his new dignity. The days in which he lived were days of battle, and Ignatius, not forgetting his first vocation, was impatient to enter the melee. Protestantism, a giant in its infancy, standing in a menacing attitude, with the Bible in one hand and the sword in the other, bid defiance to the impugners of the sacred volume. Catholicism, old in the debauch of power, discredited by the vices of its ministers, could only oppose his formidable antagonist with a scattered and undisciplined army of monks and priests, rendered effete by a life of infamy and debauchery. At this critical moment, Ignatius rushed to the rescue with an army, small indeed in number, but composed of brave and resolute souls, learned, eloquent, passionate, trained to fight, fully persuaded, as almost every soldier is, that theirs was the just cause, and to them the victory ought to belong. The disciples of Ignatius took the field high in spirits, and prepared, if need be, to sacrifice their liberty, their blood, their lives, their all for the cause they had embraced, which was in their eyes the cause of God. They dispersed to every part of Europe. Lefebvre from the Congress of Worms proceeded to Spain. Lyons and Leger succeeded him in Germany. Bobadilla went to Naples. Bret and Samion to Ireland. Rodriguez and Xavier to Portugal. Everywhere these rigid and fanatic monks were, on the one hand, engaged in theological discussion, while, on the other, they preached repentance to the people and reform to the clergy, and paid no regard to the hatred evinced towards them by both Protestants and Catholics. It seems as if they courted persecution and wished to wear the martyr's crown. When the infuriated populace of Venice threatened to throw Leger into the Danube, he smiled scornfully and calmly answered, "What do I care whether I enter heaven by water or land?" From Rome, Ignatius, as an able general, directed the movements of all his soldiers of Christ, as they styled themselves. He praised one, admonished another, inspired all with his zeal and fanaticism. Nor was this enough for his ardent and indefatigable spirit. He turned his attention to less unquestionable acts of religion and charity. Many of the hospitals erected in the middle of Rome were the fruits of his zealous exertions. The convent of Santa Martha was opened for abandoned women who wished to repent and pass an upright and easy life. In that of Santa Catherine, poor and honest young girls found asylum against temptation and seduction. Fatherless children of both sexes were received and carefully educated in two hospitals which yet existed in Rome, and the inmates of which, on the 31st of July of every year, go in procession to the Church of Jesuit to pray to the shrine of the saint and to give thanks to their benefactor. However, the gratitude which we owe Loyola for those charitable institutions cannot restrain our indigenous and abhorrence towards the man who had so great a share in reviving the infamous tribunal of the Inquisition. The Jesuits reckon it among the glories of their order that Loyola supported, by a special memorial to the Pope, a petition for the reorganizing of that cruel and abhorred tribunal. In the 13th century, the Inquisition had been diabolically active. 25,000 Albigensians perished for bearing testimony to the Word of God. Dominique, that wholesale butcher of the unfortunate Christians, by his barbarous inhumanity struck horror throughout Europe and gained for himself a place among the Roman saints. But, as is always the case, its very excess prepared a reaction. The tribunal, as if satiated with human suffering, gradually relented, and, in the epoch of which we are speaking, had almost fallen into decay. Besides, the Inquisitioners, chosen from among the monastic orders, were little inclined to enforce strict and severe laws against practices or opinions with which they themselves were in many cases chargeable. Above all, the See of Rome, under the Alexanders, the Juliuses, the Leos, plunged in political affairs, and extremely lax in matters of religion and morality, had little or no inclination to enforce the almost forgotten edicts of the Inquisition. But the new doctrine spread in Germany with amazing rapidity, and the outcry raised against the morals of the Catholic clergy pronounced two immediate effects: the partial reform of the more flagrant abuses of which the clergy were guilty, and the revival of the tribunal, which should destroy by fire and sword whoever dared to impugn the doctrines of the Pope and the canonical laws. Carafa, whom we have already mentioned, was the principal author of this dreadful tribunal. Through his exertions and those of Loyola, an edict appeared on the 21st of July, 1542, appointing 6 cardinals commissioners of the Holy See and general inquisitioners, with power to delegate their authority to any person they pleased. All ranks of citizens, without exception, were subject to these inquisitioners. Suspected persons were immediately imprisoned, the guilty punished with death, and their property confiscated. No book could be printed or sold, and such is still the case through nearly the whole of Italy, without the authority of the Inquisitioner. Hence, a catalogue of prohibited books, the first issue of which, containing 70 works, appeared at Venice. In order that the tribunal might be made more efficient, Carafa drew up himself the following stringent rules. First, when faith is in question, there must be no delay, but on the slightest suspicion, rigorous measures must be resorted to with all speed. Secondly, no consideration is to be shown to either prince or prelate, however high his station. Thirdly, Extreme severity is to be exercised against all those who attempt to shield themselves under the protection of any potentate, and those only are to be treated with gentleness and fatherly compassion who make a full and frank confession of charges laid against them. Fourthly, no man must debase himself by showing toleration towards heretics of any kind, and above all, to Calvinists. This terrible tribunal, in the hands of the relentless and unforgiving Carafa, spread desolation and dismay throughout Italy. From its very commencement, thousands were arraigned before it, whose only crime consisted in becoming the unhappy victims of such as were actuated by the fell rage of revenge, or the thirst for power or wealth. In a word, by any or all of these foul passions, which degrade and brutalize humanity, as sacerdotal ferocity then called to its aid the might of the secular arm and thus became all-powerful. Death assumed a new and more terrible aspect, and he who should invent new instruments of torture to dislocate the limbs of victims with the most exquisite and excruciating pains possible would be rewarded. Throughout Italy and in various parts of Europe, you might have seen, whilst the infernal flames of the pile were ascending, the sinister and diabolical smile of the Jesuits, who were aiming at the increase of their order under the shade of this all-mastering power. But we must resume our history. The first college of the order was founded in Coimbra in 1542. By John III of Portugal. The same year, 25 of his subjects were admitted into it under the superintendence of Rodriguez. Lyons, aided by the Lippomana family, erected another at the same time in Venice. A third was built in Padua. After that, Italy became studded with them. Those youth whom Loyola, in the beginning of 1540, had sent to Paris to study and receive a degree in its university, became expelled from France, went to Louvain under the direction of Lefebvre, became the inmates of a college afterwards famous. The Jesuits had already many colleges established in Germany, one of which was nursing in its bosom Peter Canisius, who became most notorious for his cruelties. In Spain, also, the New World met with prodigious success. Besides being the birthplace of Ignatius and 6 of the founding members of the order, it succeeded at its very commencement in making a conquest of no less a person than Francis Borgia, Duke of Candia, a vice-king of Barcelona. The authority of his name, his exertions, and the eloquence of his father, Adals, soon covered Spain with houses and colleges. Since the year 1543, the order already counting 9 houses and more than 80 professed members, Paul III, who at first had limited the number of Jesuits to 60, being highly satisfied with those new champions of the Roman See, issued another bull on the 15th of March, 1543, by which he empowered the order to receive an unlimited number of members. In speaking of the different countries into which the Jesuits had introduced themselves, we have purposely passed over England, and that for 2 reasons. First, because, writing in England and for English readers, we consider it but fair to expatiate all the more on what particularly concerns their own country. Secondly, because the 2 first Jesuits who entered England were entrusted with a special political mission, the first one of the kind, and which we are going to relate. The severe and somewhat capricious edicts of Henry VIII, even after More and Fisher had perished by the hands of the executioner, while but partly obeyed in England, were totally disregarded in Ireland. True it is that a great part of the aristocracy, for fear of proscription and compensation, had yielded to Henry's orders, and even supported him in his despotic policy, but the bulk of the nation, more perhaps out of hatred to their oppressor than from real attachment to their religion, refused to subscribe to a creed violently enforced by a hated and despotic power. Not content with opposing Henry and his religious ordinances, they, under the very pretense of religion, caused partial insurrections, with the view of shaking off the yoke of their masters. But the power of Henry bore down all opposition, and, as Dr. Lingard says, the English domination over Ireland never appeared to be more firmly established. In such a state of things, the Archbishop Armagh, a Scottish man by birth, abandoning the flock confided to his care, fled to Rome to employ the assistance of his master the Pope. Paul had already evinced great anger against Henry for his apostasy. His anger was increased by the fact that not only was he unable to prevail on either Francis I or Charles V to invade England, but that these monarchs had, in the face of his express commands, made successfully a treaty with the excommunicated king. Accordingly, his resentment knew no bounds. However, the means which Paul had at command to contend with Henry was inadequate to gratify the hate which rankled in his bosom towards him. Determined, nevertheless, not to remain inactive, he thought of dispatching some emissaries into Ireland in order that, by working upon the ignorant and bigoted minds of his fanatic inhabitants, he might excite them to a civil war. With this pious end in view, he turned his eyes to the newly established society and asked from the general 2 of its members to be sent thither. From that day, down to the recent mission of Cardinal Wiseman, the court of Rome has striven, more or less openly, more or less eagerly, to exasperate the Irish Catholics against the English Protestants, and has made Ireland a sore thorn to the sister island. Many a time did Pius V exclaim that he would willingly shed his blood in a war against England, and Gregory XIII was seriously meditating to march in person and head the insurrection which broke out in Ireland during the reign of Elizabeth. The 2 Jesuits whom Ignatius gave to the Pope for this mission were Salmeron and Brut, who received secret instructions from the Pope and were honored with the name of Papal Nuncios. They accepted with joy the perils of the embassy, but were no way ambitious of the luster and honor which the little title conferred. According to Mr. Cretinino, the fact is that they could not and would not have dared to assume in public the title of the Pope's legates or nuncios, and were obligated to content themselves to be simple and secret emissaries. Ignatius also gave them private instructions, and we may thank Orlandini for having sent down this document, which, if well examined, clearly shows that the crafty and mysterious policy for which the society has earned such merited notoriety and execration is as old as the order. Here is the precise document which, however, shows a remarkable knowledge of human nature. I recommend you to be in intercourse with all the world in general, but particularly with your equals and inferiors, modest and circumspect in your words, always disposed and patient to listen, lending an attentive ear till the persons who speak to you have unveiled the depth of their sentiments. Then you will give them a clear and brief answer which may anticipate all discussion. In order to conciliate to yourselves the goodwill of men in the desire of extending the kingdom of God, you will make yourselves all things to all men after the example of the apostle, in order to gain them to Jesus Christ. Nothing, in effect, is more adapted than the resemblance of tastes and habits to conciliate affection and gain hearts. Thus, after having studied the character and manners of each person, you will endeavor to conform yourselves to them as much as duty will permit, so that, if you have to do with an excitable and ardent character, you should shake of all tedious prolixity. You must, on the contrary, become somewhat slow and measuring in speech. If the person to whom you speak is more circumspect and deliberate in his speech, for the rest, if he has to do with a man of irascible temperament has himself that defect, and if they do not agree thoroughly in their opinion, it is greatly to be feared lest they permit themselves to be hurried into passion. Therefore, he who recognizes in himself that propensity ought to watch himself with the most vigilant care and fortitude his heart with a supply of strength, in order that anger should not surprise him, but rather he may endure with equanimity all that he shall suffer from the others, even should the latter be his inferior. Discussions and quarrels are much less to be apprehended from quiet and slow tempers than from the excitable and ardent. In order to attract men to virtue and to fight the enemy of salvation, you shall employ the arms he uses to destroy them. Such is the advice of St. Basil. When the devil attacks a just man, he does not let him see his snares. On the contrary, he hides them and attacks him only indirectly, without resisting his pious inclinations, feigning to even conform to them. But by degrees he entices him and surprises him in his snare. Thus it is proper to follow a similar track to extricate men from sin, beginning with praising what is good in them, without at first attacking their vices. When you shall have gained their confidence, apply the remedy proper for their cure. With regard to melancholy or unsettled persons, establish, whilst addressing them as much as you can, a gay and serene countenance. Give the greatest sweetness to your words, in order to restore them to a state of mental tranquility, combating one extreme by another extreme. Not only in your sermons, but also in your private conversations, particularly when you reconcile people at variance, do not lose sight of the fact that all your words may be published. What you say in darkness may be manifested in the light of day. In affairs, anticipate the time rather than defer or adjourn it. If you promise anything for tomorrow, do it today. As to money, do not touch even that which shall be fixed for the expenses which you shall pay. Let it be distributed to the poor by other hands, or employ it in good works, in order that you may be able, in case of need, to affirm an oath that in the course of your legation you have not received a penny. When you have to speak to the great, let Pasci Bruit have the charge. Deliberate with yourselves in all the points touching which your sentiments might be at variance. Do what 2 persons out of 3 would have approved if called upon to decide. Write often to Rome during your journey as soon as you shall have reached Scotland, and also when you shall have got over to Ireland. Then give an account of your legation monthly. Now examine well these instructions, and you will find that the true Jesuit must be crafty, insinuating, deceitful, even whilst pretending to be a most sincere Christian, and as if raised by God to defend his holy land. Their sacrilegious maxim, that no means can be bad when the end is good, sanctifies in their eyes the most atrocious crimes. At first sight, these precepts which Ignatius gave to the 2 emissaries of Paul, although not very honest, appeared in themselves prudent instructions for proceeding in what they considered a most holy cause, the maintenance of the Catholic religion, but applied them to political purposes, and Ignatius knew that this was the case, and you will at once perceive the extent of the Jesuit immorality, and the artful way in which, in the name of the most sacred of all things, religion, they accomplish the most heinous offenses. But listen to the ingenious Mr. Cretinoli. In these instructions, says he, Loyola takes care to be silent about those which the Pope had given them. He keeps aloft his politics. Samarin and Brute are the Pope's legates and have his confidence. Ignatius endeavors to make them worthy of it, but he does not go beyond. Good. You confess, then, that Paul, Christ's vicegerent, is plotting revenge under the garb of religion, and that he has sent the Jesuits on a political mission. Ignatius, confident in Paul's ability, confined himself to the prescribing of rules calculated to ensure success in their undertaking. You prize him for that and boast that he keeps aloft from politics? Good. Salmeron and Brute set out on their mission, and as they were ordered, visited Holyrood on their way to Ireland. James V was then on the throne of Scotland, who, there is a reason to believe, says the author of the Tales of a Grandfather, was somewhat inclined to the Reformed doctrines. At least he encouraged the poet Lindsay to compose bitter satires against the corruptions of the Roman Catholic clergy. His uncle, Henry VIII, encouraged him in this disposition, strongly advised him to take possession of the immense wealth of the religious orders, and desired an interview with him at York in the beginning of the year 1542. Henry went there and waited 6 days for his nephew, but he never made his appearance. There can be little doubt that the Jesuits, who had arrived in Scotland some time before with the Pope's letter for the king, to whom they were introduced by Beaton, of cruel and tragic memory, who known Loyola at Rome, used their utmost influence to prevent this meeting. Nor do I think it's presumptuous to assert that the two Jesuits and the letter which they brought from Paul, who exhorted the king to remain faithful to the religion of his fathers, were the chief cause that detained him at home. The war which followed soon after, with disastrous consequences to both nations and especially to Scotland, as well as the torrents of blood shed during a long course of religious struggles, would, in all likelihood, have been avoided had James resisted the influence of the Jesuits. Meanwhile, Paul's two emissaries arrived in Ireland about the month of February 1542. There, according to Jesuitical historians, they wrought prodigies, reforming and stirring up the people, and confirming them in the tenets of the true religion, celebrating masses, hearing confessions, and especially granting many indulgences, exacting from the people a very moderate tax, which, according to the instructions of Ignatius, was not gathered by themselves, but by a stranger. The people flocked around them and poured out benedictions upon their head. Their adversaries, on the other hand, assert that they plotted to stir up one class of citizens against another, and drain the pockets of the credulous Irishmen so forcefully that at last they became so audacious in the eyes of the people that they threatened to deliver them into the hands of Henry's officers. We ourselves believe that both of these versions are in part true. No doubt they, to keep up appearance and masses, heard many confessions, granted millions of indulgences, but there is little doubt that they excited the people against their excommunicated sovereign, whom, to be faithful to their religion, they must execrate and use all their efforts to dethrone. That they controlled money from the people, either party confess, but whether that money was employed for the repairing of churches and the supporting of widows and orphans, as the one pretends, or as an ailment to foment civil war, as the other assert, is not sufficiently ascertained. We leave our readers to judge for themselves. Certain it is, however, they only continued in Ireland for 34 days, and during that time they wandered about from place to place in disguise, never sleeping 2 successive nights under the same roof, afraid every moment of being seized. Upon leaving, they formed the noble complot, says Mr. Critanida, illustrating Orlandini, of going to London and finding means of being admitted into Henry's presence, when, by their eloquence and tenderness, they would disarm the anger of the king in pleasing the cause of the Catholic religion. At the tribunal of his conscience, it was as well for Henry and England too, that their plan was found to be impractical. We must not forget that they were emissaries of that Paul who thought the sword and the stake for the conversion of heretics to be the most effectual and conclusive argument. Neither must we forget that some years after, James Clement and Ravaillac adopted a more expeditious way than eloquence for the converting of Henry's third and fourth. Salmeron and Brut thought it advisable in these circumstances to retire into France, and being ordered by Paul to return again into Scotland, they refused to obey and went direct to Rome. Thus ended the first mission into England. Would to God it had been the last. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.